Okay, here we are. How about that? This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. Welcome to anybody who's here for the first time today. Everybody else, what's up? How's everyone doing? I don't know where or when you happen to be listening to this, but right now for me in this moment, I am here in Pennsylvania, and spring has sprung. Everything's starting to turn green, and all the trees are coming out, and all the flowers are bursting out. It's quite a wonderful feeling to feel the earth alive, you know? Is there really any debate about that? Come on. In any case, it's got a very lovely feeling here today on this Sunday afternoon. I'm hoping to bring it with me a little bit right here through this microphone into your ear, no matter where or when that is. I really appreciate you listening. I hope that you're doing okay. And speaking of that, speaking of how we're feeling, I haven't checked in with all of y'all for a while on my hip pain, on my chronic inflammation pain in general. Remember we were talking about hypermobility syndromes and gait patterns and glide syndromes and stuff? Well, like I do with a lot of things, I think I got myself just overthinking it too much, just taking in too much information. And I actually think that when I do that, I just get overloaded and I'm kind of nowhere. It's hard to, I don't know, sometimes I make things worse with too much thinking about it or too much information. And so I kind of let go of it and just started doing things a little bit more on instinct, and did make some very interesting changes that have really, I don't know, led to some new things that I think are shifting. And I mean, overall, my pain levels have been pretty good. And I guess I'm happy to share more about that, but I don't want to do it here. It'll take a while. So maybe we'll leave it to the other side. If you want to stick around to the other side of today's conversation, I'll be happy to tell you some of the things I've been doing and how they've been helping or not. And, if anybody's interested, you can stick around for that. But it's certainly in line with today's conversation that we would discuss how we are and how we're seeing ourselves. So that's certainly the topic at hand. My guest is Jessamyn Stanley. I don't know if everybody listening would know who Jessamyn is. I'm sure a lot of you do, but maybe you don't. And if that's the case, I would just say that Jessamyn is somebody who gained some notoriety some years back. I mean, it was years before the pandemic. I remember we had a number of conversations here on the show around body positivity in yoga and accessible yoga in general. And there's a lot of talk about representation and seeing people with different types of bodies. I remember we talked about the Kripalu cover and the Dove commercial where they had people with different body shapes, and we're talking about how we thought that was good and getting away from this idea of a yoga body. And Jessamyn was somebody who became known, I think, first through her postings on Instagram. Like, she gained some following on Instagram in the earlier time of Instagram. If you remember when I had Rachel Braven on some years back, she talked about that time when she was first on Instagram, just kind of posting what she was doing. And like at that time, the algorithm wasn't the same as it is now. And it was sort of easier in certain ways to gain like followers on that platform, I think, than it is now. And I think Jessamyn was somebody who really did resonate with a lot of people, who was on the platform and ultimately found herself with a lot of interesting gigs. She's got commercials, a Gatorade commercial. We talk about it, and, magazine covers, and all of that, I think, has put her in a very unique position to talk about, like, what are the narratives around bodies and what it's like to disrupt them. And I will also mention that what she's doing now, like her more recent projects, I think continue to really raise questions. You'll hear she's got an OnlyFans offering that is really interesting. I've been talking about it with a lot of people since I recorded this. So I'm curious what anybody listening today thinks, and you should always feel welcome to reach out and, share your responses with me. I'm always curious to hear. I'll forward them to Jessamyn. I'm sure she'd be happy to hear them too, because I think that's a lot of the spirit of her work, is to get people having conversations about things that maybe we wouldn't be. So I couldn't have been happier to have had this opportunity to connect with Jessamyn, and it is really my pleasure to share it with you today. Real quick before we get to that, I do want to mention that if you've been listening to the show and you enjoy what you're getting from it, and you're interested in having other opportunities to connect with me or other people who are also interested in the things that we talk about here on the show, or maybe you're looking for some deeper learning opportunities, I want to encourage you to check out my other stuff. I've got a full range of possibilities. We try to have a nice spectrum of pricing so that people of all different resources can have an opportunity to engage. You can find all of it at jbrownyoga.com. All right, I think that's good. I will touch base with you on the other side, and we'll check in on a few things. But for now, I think it would be best for us to get to it and listen to this conversation I had with Jessamyn Stanley. Hello?
Hello. Hi. How's it going?
Is this Jessamyn?
It is. I'm just changing my name on Zoom. Hello. How's it going?
It's going pretty good. Nice to meet you. I'm Jay.
Nice to meet you too, Jay. Yeah.
Well, I'm already recording, and if it's okay with you, I'd like to consider us having just begun. Is that all right with you?
That sounds perfect. I love that.
Cool. It seems like you can roll on the fly. I watched some of your stuff and been getting ready to talk to you. Seems like you don't have any problem just showing up.
I don't know if I don't have any problem with it, but I certainly am able to adapt. That's the yoga of it, right? If we can roll it around. Yeah.
I think so. Well, let me share with you what led us being together today. I know you had some people who had emailed me, but that was like, they emailed me like a while ago and I was busy. And then there was like a synchronicity that happened that really brought us here. And I want to share with you because it's often how these episodes sort of come about for me. Like a little thing happens that makes them happen. Mm-hmm. So, I have two daughters. One of them's 13. One of them's 8. And they've gotten to an age where it's kind of hard for us to ever be able to find something like we can all watch together. Like they don't like to watch the same stuff. They get in fights and stuff over it. So recently we discovered that they were both into watching Project Runway. You remember Project Runway?
My gosh,
I don't know if you ever watched that show
Absolutely.
From like back in the day, right?
Absolutely.
Tim Gunn, right?
Oh, yeah. Oh, my God.
Make it work. So, so in any case, they love that show. So we've been watching that show and it's on Hulu and there's commercials. Like normally they don't see commercials, I guess.
Totally. Literally.
So commercial came on. It was a Gatorade commercial that you're in.
Oh, interesting. I love for this story. I was like, commercials. Yeah. Okay. Totally. Yes.
This was recent. This was not very long ago. It's Gatorade commercial. And all of a sudden you're there busting out like a headstand at the end, kind of at the end. And my daughters loved it. They're like, look at that, Dad. Look at that. They kind of loved you representing yoga. My 13-year-old, she's kind of socially conscious minded, and she was like all like psyched about it,
Oh, I'm so glad to hear that. Honestly.
And I thought, oh, I remember her. I think her name's Jessamyn Stanley, and I remembered because there was the Yoga Journal cover thing that happened.
Absolutely.
And then literally the next day, there was another email in my inbox from someone saying, would you be interested to have Jessamyn on the show? And then I have to say, to be real, I went onto your website and I saw that you're doing this OnlyFans thing. And I was like, what?
Say more.
So that's why we're here, Jessamyn. And I'm glad to meet you. And I appreciate you giving me the time. I really, really do.
Oh my goodness. I'm honored to be here. And I love the way that all came together. I feel like that's exactly as it should be. And I'm stoked that we get to talk.
Cool. Well, I guess to kind of get us rolling here I was looking at like some bio stuff on you, and it was said that you started sharing yoga photos on Instagram at 2012. And I was thinking about that, and I was thinking back to like when I'm kind of like a Gen Xer, And so I was late to Instagram. I don't think I really even opened an account to like 2015. It was like already done.
Totally.
You know what I mean? But like, I remember talking to Rachel Braden. She was on the show, and like other people who kind of like did Instagram thing. And at a certain kind of time, it was a kind of golden time with the algorithm or whatever. But I guess I'm curious because you did end up becoming like a more higher profile yoga teacher. And I guess I'm kind of curious how that happens. Was it through Instagram stuff that you did, or what do you think was the kind of factors that led to you kind of ending up being in a Gatorade commercial so many years later?
I love so much what you said about like being a Gen Xer and like getting on Instagram after it was kind of done, because I had the opposite experience where I've been blogging to some degree or like creating content since I was in middle school. And honestly, like when I was in high school, and I should have been I think on paper, I should have been paying closer attention to what was happening in class. I was on like Blogspot and AIM Instant Messenger and just like doing all, and then eventually like in college on LiveJournal and all of that, Tumblr especially, all of that content creation really just turned into learning a lot about fat acceptance and body positivity. And those movements really changed my life. I got to know a lot of different, it was before everybody was it was before influencership, before it was a thing to be a content creator. But now I got to be really familiar with what we now call influencers, who specifically focus on fat acceptance, and really seeing that there weren't many fat people exercising on the internet publicly. That was very interesting to me. And I started practicing yoga around like 2010 through 12. What year was this? Like 2011, I guess. And I started practicing at home around 2012. And that experience of practicing yoga alone at home, I think in general can be kind of isolating. And it's like, you don't really know, like, am I doing this right? So I started sharing my yoga practice on social media just so that I could connect with other practitioners and find out, like, does my triangle pose look like your triangle pose? But I had a lot of people reach out to me, very few people being like, yes, this is what I think about your triangle pose. And more had people being like, I didn't know that fat people could do yoga. And I was just like, why do you think that fat people can't do yoga? Fat people do all kinds of things all the time. And so this was also, again, pointing out to me that like, there's just a really huge visibility problem, and that it's more important to just share your life as a fat person authentically, like just that, to do that one act could inspire people who are not fat, who are not Black, who are not queer, can inspire anyone to live their best life and to be really present. And I think that as a yoga practitioner, I've always had a lot of conflict around social media, because I think that ultimately social media asks us to do the opposite of what yoga does. Like, I think that yoga is all about looking within yourself, and social media is all about thinking about what other people think of you. And I, over time, have come to feel like the way that we can share our practices on social media expands the idea of what yoga is, and it makes it more accessible to more people. And so that is why I've continued to share my practice. But I think that the way, just to answer your question more directly, like how did sharing on Instagram turn into being in a Gatorade ad? Like, I think that my mission consistently on social media has just been to share my practice as it is and just to be honest about it. And that means that I share a version of yoga that I think is not often seen. And I think there are a lot of parameters that people put around like what the definition of yoga is. And people don't generally think that yoga is political or that it is radical or hard to sit with. And I found yoga to exclusively be those things, political, hard to sit with, like, so that I'm like, it means that ultimately, what I share on social media is less about how other people engage with it and more about whether or not this is my yoga. So I think that as a message carried by other brands, whether it's Gatorade or Adidas or Kotex, Calvin Klein, whoever, I think that the message of be yourself, be true to yourself, be authentic, that is timeless. And so that's how I think that all of those things aligned. And it wasn't something that, like, I really pushed back against being a yoga teacher for a long time because I felt like literally there are thousands of yoga teachers. Like, people would ask me to come teach them yoga. Let me back up. Because I was sharing my yoga practice on social media, people would ask me to come teach them. And I would be like, there are literally thousands of yoga teachers. You should, like, I would recommend teachers, recommend online platforms. And still they'd just be like, I want for you to come teach me. And so ultimately I made a list of everywhere in the world that people had asked me to teach. And I was like, okay, cool. Once I go to all of these places, then I can stop teaching. And in my mind, I'm still just working my way down that list. And what became clear is that you can't get to every place physically all the time, but finding different methods, whether it's books, podcasts, online classes, that is what has motivated everything from there on out.
Wow. Well, thank you for that. I think that's very interesting to me. I did read that you had a degree in video and film production, if I'm not mistaken. And I think that those kinds of skills are the kind of skills that people who have managed to, find some success online with their teaching have had to develop in one way or another.
I feel like I'm still developing them every day. Totally.
But it's also interesting to me to just hear how what I hear you saying is that you were able to initially be putting yourself out online in a way that was very authentic to who you were, and that was like resonating with people. And that's what they want from a yoga teacher a lot of times. They want a feeling of connection. So whatever it was that you were putting out, people were connecting to them. But it also is interesting to hear you say how it's kind of evolved for yourself in terms of like for you in the process of doing it, whether or not it's about like what you're giving other people or what you're just putting out, or something like that. And I've been recently just talking about like changing the relationship to the screens in general. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of like about that in terms of there was a different time where we were just like sharing things with our friends and we weren't just promoting all of our businesses or whatever, or something. And in truth, it's the connections that people make with you that lead them to want to be a part of whatever else you might be doing, whether it's yoga teaching or whatever else. I guess I am curious. You mentioned that you had started yoga earlier, but then you were at home. Was there not centers that you felt that, because I've had a bunch of other people on who were motivated by, part of the body positive movement in yoga. And they've often talked about how they didn't feel like there was yoga centers that they could go to. And I'm wondering if that played any part in your trajectory as well.
It did, but I think that the bigger obstacle was financial like an inability to afford to practice in yoga studios. So when I first started practicing, I was practicing at a Bikram yoga studio in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. And I don't remember how much the monthly membership was or the drop-in rate, but I remember it being more than I could afford as a grad student. And the only reason that I was able to practice at that studio is because I had a work study. So I would like help clean the studios, and you practice like 4 to 5 times a week. And then after class, you'd help clean. And that program was literally the only way that I was able to become really devoted to the practice. But then so a bunch of things happened, some of which I actually talk about in my first book, Everybody Yoga. So I won't go into that much detail about it, but if you can find Everybody Yoga literally anywhere the books are sold. But in that book, I talk about how a bunch of stuff happened that led to me not having a place to live and not having a job and living in a new town. And when that happened, I couldn't afford to practice yoga in studios at all. And I couldn't find a work study opportunity. I remember looking them up and they were just like wait lists. And I was like a little bit depressed by that. And during that time, I stopped practicing yoga for a few weeks. And that ultimately, that was when things started to really hit the fan. And my, what I talk about in the book is that my aunt passed away really unexpectedly, and it sent me into this downward spiral of depression. And I was like, what was making me feel good before? Yoga? Okay, well, I just got to figure out a way to do this right now. And so literally, like, I had my dad's old Pilates mat, and by that point, my partner and I had moved into this tiny apartment together, and I would like push all the furniture out of this one corner of the room and roll out my dad's old Pilates mat, and I would just do the postures from the Bikram sequence that I felt comfortable practicing by myself, that I was like, I think it's probably okay to do this without a teacher. But it was less about, I mean, like, it is true that certainly where I was practicing in North Carolina, there were very few places where I felt included. Like, as a fat Black queer practitioner, even to this day, I think it is very common to feel excluded from most yoga spaces. And so I don't want to discount the fact that, like, I definitely did not feel seen in community, but I also could not, part of not feeling seen was not feeling like there were options that fit my budget. And so that was where my home practice really flourished, was out of necessity.
Right. And did you start teaching before there were like the bigger gigs, or after there was the bigger gigs?
No. So I guess after, or I guess before. I started teaching. Okay, I was working in a restaurant at the time, and all the guys that worked in the kitchen of the restaurant, at the end of the night, they would ask me, like, well, I was going to say they would ask me for stretching tips. They would ask me to massage their backs, because they all, like, if you work in a restaurant or work in any kind of service, you're standing all the time and you're making like very short motions with your hips. And so I would talk to them about the psoas muscle and be like, do deep lunges that'll help open up your pelvis. And so that was really how I started teaching yoga, was like in the kitchen of the restaurant that I worked at. And then that turned into teaching pay what you can yoga classes in the park of the town that I lived in. Literally, I would just like roll up with like my yoga mat and just tell people, like, it's going to be pay what you can yoga in the park. And people would show up. I remember there was a couple that would bring like this giant beach blanket that they would use as their shared yoga mat. And like somebody who brought like strawberries to pay for class. Like, it was the most beautiful experience. And it was something that really was not about anything other than like being in community with other people. And I went to teacher training only because I had so many people ask me to teach them. And even when I went to training, like, I mean, this is kind of a story. So like, I was really against it. I said before, but like, I can't over express.
I hear you. I was teaching for years before they even started 200-hour trainings. And then I did one too, because you had to kind of like feel like you were legit or something or whatever.
Well, I was just like, I didn't have money to practice in studios. I certainly didn't have money to go to a teacher training. And I also had like other goals in life. I was not thinking about that. But I had a conversation with my father, who had always been very anti anything that I was doing on the internet, anything. He did not understand. He was like, yoga, what are you talking about? Because I left this out of the story, but I had dropped out of graduate school. And so he was just on this constant tip of like, when are you going back to grad school? And one time we were talking, and this was after I'd had some press mentions. And let's say, I can't remember exactly what it was, but it might have been like People magazine or something. But he was like, well, your mom told me that you were in People, what's going on with this yoga thing? And I was like, oh, I don't know. Like, I want to go to training, but I can't afford it. And he was like, well, how much does it cost for you to go to training? And I was like, it's $3,000. And he was like, well, what if we could help you find that money? Because it seems like you should do this. And I was like, if this guy is saying that I need to do it, that is the universe saying that I need to do it, because never has there ever been anyone who was more against this. But when I went to training, I really came to understand why there have to be so many yoga teachers, and really why, in some way, why we all should teach our yoga. And I think that the way that I process this practice is not going to resonate for everybody, but it might resonate for even one person. And if that one person can find compassion for themselves and they can offer that compassion to one other person, then that starts a ripple effect where we can live in a world that is not dictated by fear and is actually coming from a place of love and compassion. So that was really why I was like, okay, well, I'll just teach. Like, I made my list of all the places that I needed to get to. And I was like, okay, cool. So I'll just get to all of these places. And that, I think that ramping up my teaching and being more intentional about it, that led to some of these bigger projects that you're talking about.
I get it. So I guess there was like overlap because there was like the mention in People.
Exactly.
But you hadn't really gotten the yoga journal cover yet.
Exactly. Literally. Great example. That's exactly right. Yeah.
Right. And I know that that's true. I did like the travel gig thing too, but not until I let go of a center, like in 2017 or so. So that was sort of the tail end of that too. But earlier on, there was kind of like a whole circuit of gigs.
Totally. Oh my goodness. Before the pandemic, I feel like there was just a whole world of like, regularly, I guess we're sort of moving back into that, but
a little bit, but not the same as it was.
No, totally. And to be honest, I've always been very introverted. I really don't, before quarantine, I really did not appreciate group classes. I was like, I always prefer to be at a distance from people. I love teaching online. My online platform, The Underbelly, is like the perfect way for me because I'm like, I can be close to people, but not actually have to like be close to them. But I taught one class like right at the tail end of quarantine, and it was so impactful to me, just like what it meant to be in space together and like just that energy. And I feel like I really did not appreciate that prior to the big shift. And so I'm excited to see us moving back into more in person and seeing what it looks like for us to teach around the world again.
Well, I appreciate that. Me too, because I realized it's just like I was reflecting that maybe 4 years ago, more than 50% of what I did involved me being in a room with other people. And now it's like 0%.
Totally.
And that kind of freaked me out. I'm like, whoa, I want to get a better balance back between those things, because it all did come from, like you said, like a very pure place in yourself where you show up to offer yoga classes in the park for strawberries or whatever.
Right.
Because usually anybody who does stick with it, I know you were like a reluctant to take on the hat, but people who stick with it over time, I do think it's because the ritual of being a teacher, it's serving other people and serving them in some way,
And that's really, so we started doing live classes at the Underbelly for this exact reason. I felt like I need to be just doing some kind of offering where I can be living my practice and sharing the practice. And it's not about anything other than having a connection with another human being, because I think that is what's so powerful about us all coming together. Is like, there's a lot of really beautiful energy that we can harness and manifest together that it just literally can't happen when you're by yourself. And there is another way of building energy when you are on your own that is itself so powerful and magnificent and needed. But to be in community with other people who are opening their spirits is just something that I think it certainly doesn't, there's no dollar amount that you can put on it. It's very, very powerful.
Yeah. And it does transcend the technology some, because I know you've been through like the range of like doing on-demand videos. I saw like whatever beginner videos from Yoga Journal of You on YouTube or whatever. And then the newer like live classes, they do have, especially when people come over time. I have relationships with people all over the world via Zoom that are deeply meaningful and powerful.
Right.
So as much as it freaks me out, that's so much of what I do is just me and my laptop. It isn't just me and my laptop. I am actually making real connection with people. So
what is your sun sign?
My sun sign is a Gemini.
Oh, okay. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to like scream in your ear. I just really
okay.
like, I just love that. Thank you so much.
Okay.
What day?
June 8th.
Oh, yeah. That's my parents' wedding anniversary. I love that.
All right. I don't, I gotta say, I haven't spent a lot of time with the astrology. I read Rob Bresney. I've always liked him, but I never really spent a lot of time with it. But what made you respond to me being a Gemini? What does that mean to you? Why did you like that?
I love a Gemini. I really feel like Geminis remind us how to have fun in this life and how to find a smile, and like that it's just not that serious, but that knowledge is power and it's fun. Y'all make knowledge fun. I think that other air signs.
I like that. That's serious. Cool. Yeah. I didn't know that was a Gemini trait. That's cool.
Y'all are Puck in A Midsummer Night's Dream. It's like a sea of Puck, and I just love it.
Oh, that's cool. All right. Well, I guess what I'm curious then is, because I did mention that like the first thing that popped to my mind, which is a shame maybe, although that's not true. The first thing that popped to my mind was that it was cool that my 13-year-old like thought you were cool. But it was that I thought of the Yoga Journal cover thing that happened. Because I do remember there was a really big moment for like body positivity movement and accessible yoga movement within yoga. There was like I had a bunch of people on the show. I remember a lot of conversations were happening about that. And then you getting on Yoga Journal was like this big deal, but then it was weird because they did like the split cover. Can you explain from your perspective what happened with all that?
Interesting. What I think happened is that Yoga Journal made a decision that felt in line with their values at the time. And I think that they learned a lot about the global wellness community and what people were really hungry for. And I don't think that I am the first, but like what happened, like literally if someone's listening, like, what are you talking, what happened?
Yeah, we got to tell them what happened.
They ran a cover of the January 2019 edition of Yoga Journal where I am on the cover, but they also ran a duplicate cover where Marius Radi, who is a celebrated Yoga Works teacher.
Yeah, I had someone on recently. We did a whole like episode about her very recently.
Oh, wonderful. Awesome. Yeah. Okay, great. Well, yes. So Madi was also featured on another cover that same, and I found out about this in Barnes and Noble looking at the cover.
I have to say, let me just say this out loud if I'm allowed to. I think I'm allowed to say this, that it's kind of crazy that if they were going to do another cover with someone else, because she's like the smallest not Black woman you would ever see, you know?
Yeah. And I mean, I think that kind of points to what often happens when, not just Black people, but anyone who is marginalized is tokenized, that ultimately, especially in the mainstream arena, there is a feeling of like, I think by a lot of major institutions, there's a feeling of like wanting to hedge your bets or like wanting to make it accessible to everyone. And so I could see from Yoga Journal's perspective how they were trying to increase accessibility. But I think that what was revealed is the way that white supremacy lives in everything in our society. I would say no more or less so than it does in the yoga industry specifically. So I actually felt like it was really cool because because I think that yoga is everything. I think that every part of our lives is yoga. And I think that one of the things that has been so unfortunate about the American yoga world is that it is almost exclusively about fitness and clothing and what you look like. And it's not really about looking within yourself. But when we do apply yoga to every part of ourselves, then we see the way that white supremacy and transphobia, the way that gender inequity, homophobia, ageism, the way that all of these things are just literally lying right below the surface. And we just skate over them out of fear of what it will feel to be a part of the problem. And I thought that this was a really great example of yoga journals seeing the way that they are a part of the problem and having an opportunity to do something different. And also creating a space for open dialogue that is, again, itself yoga. And I think there's this really cool opportunity that we have as a community of practitioners to do that work that we talk about so often, but see done so rarely, of like actually looking at the hard parts of ourselves and accepting it, and then making an example through that for other people to follow. So I think that the conflict was good from my perspective. And I feel like, yeah, I've been in a few different situations at this point where I've had like negative feedback or responses to something that I've done. Like, I know there's been a lot of pushback against the Gatorade ads. And I think that there has been pushback. I was on the cover of Cosmopolitan UK a couple years ago, and I was like, Piers Morgan, who does a morning show in the UK, was talking about it. And every time that something like that happens, I'm just like, this is why I did it. This was the whole point. Like, I don't think that it's really that interesting to be a token, but I do think that it is interesting to start a conversation that leads to systemic change. So that's where I sit with all that.
It's very interesting because, there was certainly like a lot of backlash, I think, towards Yoga Journal, and they don't really seem to be like as influential in the yoga world now as they used to be. They certainly don't. They got sold off to whatever, and like they're not the magazine that it once was.
Totally. They've certainly changed a lot. And it's interesting, like even thinking back to Yoga Journal, like in the 70s, it has evolved so much since then. And like now to being completely digital and definitely having like a much more inclusive outlook where there's just more diversity of topics, quite frankly. I think that that's really cool. Like that's cool that they can evolve and that the practice can evolve and that we can all still keep doing it, still keep trucking along.
Yeah, one way or another. And I also think it is intriguing to me what you're saying, because it points to like a kind of, it's not a black or white question in terms of, when you, like, again, like that you being in a Gatorade commercial, there's something important to that, or you getting, revealing Yoga Journal in a way that situation did start all these conversations, or Piers Morgan taking shots at you or whatever. Like that does bring awareness and conversation. And I could see that being an overall good. I guess the pushback, or like the question that the cynical part of me would be is like, well, these are like these corporations. And sometimes I feel like some of these issues, sometimes it's like these identity issues seem to be utilized in a way to like make everybody mad at each other.
Absolutely. Literally.
Rather than, and like in a way, like if we want to help, let's get everybody healthcare or whatever, like rather than, you know what I mean? The representation's been co-opted in certain ways and kind of used in ways that actually doesn't seem to further the movement or something like that.
Mm-hmm. I think that we're still at a place where just having the conversation is so important, because I think that we can't even get to these, like, in my opinion, deeply nonpartisan issues of like healthcare and education for all and a minimum living wage for all human beings. Like that, we can't even get there if we can't have a conversation about something tedious. And I think that what ends up happening when we have those conversations is that we end up fighting with each other. People who should be on the same page end up fighting with each other. And then it seems like we're not making progress. But I think that if we take a macro look, if we take a step back and you look at it as decades as opposed to annual, I think that we do see really big change. And so if you look at from 2010 to 2020, just as an example, or from 2013 to 2023, there has been tremendous change, specifically within the yoga world, but also within the world at large. Has there been even more chaos? Yes. Has there been even more discord? Absolutely. But I think that that's just a part of human evolution. And I think that's something that we can count on, that there's always going to be change. And ultimately, there's this place of like, are we doing more than we were before? And if the answer is yes, then I say, let's keep going. And it is true that, and I think this is actually a function of white supremacy, that ultimately there is a way that we all get pitted against one another, where it's like, whereas we don't see that we're all on the same side, and there are other things that we can look at our union as being an opportunity for strength against. But because we get so caught up in trying to say who's right and who's wrong and who deserves attention and who doesn't, it does shortchange the argument. And I think that even just noticing that, just to see that as a theme and to link it back to white supremacy, that feels like a lot to me. Like, let's just do that. And that feels like the stage that we're at right now.
I hear you. I guess I'm also wondering about something I wrote down that you said that was something having to do with being fat positive and being body positive not being synonymous. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if you could speak to that more, what you mean by that.
Totally. Well, fat positivity is really like the radical elder sibling of body positivity. And fat acceptance has existed since the 70s, and that I know of, really probably like the 60s, 70s. But it's something that came out of second wave feminism and is very much about fat people being able to believe that we are worthwhile and that we don't have to apologize for our existence, and that there are a lot of different ways that that can be shown in our society, whether that's like from a legal standpoint and changing laws, or if it's just about the way that we literally talk about and view fat people. Body positivity is more about how everyone is okay today. That you, no matter what you look like, no matter where you're from, nothing about you, there's no detail about you that is so specific or important to negate the fact that your existence matters today, exactly as you are. And that when you accept yourself exactly as you are today, you can do anything that you want. Which this is just like really different from the goal of fat positivity. But body positivity really came out of fat positivity. And I'm all for everybody accepting themselves, but I can also see that that has watered down the message that fat positivity strives for. That fat acceptance, fat positivity is really, fat liberation is really about the experience of being fat. And body acceptance, because it is so broad as an idea, there's a way that marginalized voices can be washed out of that narrative, so that when you search like body positivity right now, you'll see likely a lot of like not that fat cishet white women talking about how they are body positive and not acknowledging Black voices, super fat voices, disabled voices, etc. So there's a thing where it's like, it's important to acknowledge that fat positivity and body positivity are different from one another. This is totally true. But I'm also kind of on the page of, we just all need to accept our bodies, period. Because when we accept our bodies, we can have deeper conversations about what's happening in our society. But until each of us accept our bodies, none of that can happen. And we'll just keep arguing about yoga pants. So I feel like there's a opportunity for us to see our society and our experiences in it a little bit more broadly.
Well, thank you for that, first of all. And then I also heard you, or wrote, I don't know if it was written or you spoke it, but you talked about how in order to get to like a more body positive type solution, like you were just describing, we would first need to have some honest acknowledgement of what you called body negativity.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So why do you think that's important, and what do you mean by body negativity, and why we need to touch in with that first?
Yeah, totally. So we all tend to linger on the negative. And I think that we do it in groups more so than anywhere else. And we will say horrible things about ourselves. We'll say horrible things about the people near us. And we judge each other based on the way that we feel about ourselves. And that negativity about our bodies is so pervasive and so powerful. And I think that on an individual basis, it's bad enough. But when we think about how it impacts our children and how that's what they're ingesting, is like, this is how I should show up in the world. I should be critical of my body and I should be critical of everyone else's. That's just setting off a spiral wherein we're always lingering on what's wrong as opposed to what is. It's not even about what's right or wrong. It's just like, does this exist? Does it deserve to exist just because? And I think that to even acknowledge that, and to not acknowledge the way that we are all body negative and continue to be body negative, even after you've started down the road of self-acceptance, that feels like the most important thing to me. I think that what ends up happening in conversations like this is like an othering, where it's like, oh, not it. It's not me. I'm not the one who's doing that thing. That's for those people. So that even like body positivity and body acceptance is very much seen as like, I think, like a fat girls issue. It's like, oh, well, yeah, fat girls deserve the same clothes as skinny girls or something like that. And it just silos the whole topic so that it's not about how everyone, regardless of what you look like, has some level of unrest within themselves about how they look. And just to acknowledge that can be really powerful.
I really appreciate that. I think that I think someone like myself would be very hesitant to talk about my own issues with body positivity for fear of, not acknowledging or marginalizing other people who are in much more difficult situations than myself, in terms of the way, like you said, we have structural societal elements that are stacked against certain people.
I had a really interesting experience one time. I was teaching in London and I had just finished the class, and like sidebar on this class, it was in a hot yoga studio, which can just be like really.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.